Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how I use drum samples when mixing a song. Today we're going to be going over using drum samples when mixing, and I'm going to give you a very natural way to include drum samples in your mix by using the original recordings to create the samples. Now before we dive in here, if you're looking to dive a little bit deeper into mixing drums and getting a professional sound out of your home studio drum recordings, then definitely check out the link in the description for my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This is a simple workshop that's going to walk you through the 3-step process that I follow on almost every single one of my mixes to get professional, polished drum mixes right from my home studio. It is a completely free on-demand video training, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at using drum samples when mixing. So let me hit play here. I've already got a kick sample in, but I've got the raw snare in here, and I want you to take a listen to what this is sounding like here. Just kick and snare at the moment, and then we're going to talk about sample replacing the snare here, and I'm going to show you how I go about that to keep it natural and to keep it close to the original performance so everything blends together well here. But here's our kick and snare for this song. So I jumped around to a couple different places in the track so you can hear a couple things with this snare drum. And I'll play it one more time here. But what I'm hearing right off the bat with the snare drum is, number one, there's a lot of hi-hat bleed already in there. So if I go start cranking up top end to get some snap and to get some sizzle from the snares on the bottom of the drum, I'm going to be pulling up a ton of hi-hat and cymbal bleed that's going to create a lot of problems down the road. You got to think this is just the snare drum and we're hearing that much hi-hat. No overheads, no rooms, no anything yet. And we're already getting that much hi-hat bleed. That's going to become an issue down the road. The other thing that sticks out to me is as I jump around in this track here, you can hear our snare drum change in tone quite a bit. You're always going to get a little bit of a different sound from the snare drum on each hit. That's what makes it sound natural, and that's what makes it sound realistic, is the drummer doesn't hit the drum exactly the same way every time. That kind of cues you off that it is a sample when the drummer hits the drum exactly the same way and you get the same sound of it every time. That's not something we can always get when we're creating a sample, and we can kind of stray away from that to keep it more natural sounding. But that's what sticks out to me, is that it changes drastically in sound. So sometimes we have a lot of bottom end, and then sometimes it's gone and we get this little bit of mid-range ring to it. I don't want it changing that drastically, and I like the bottom end that we get in some parts. So listen one more time here, just our snare drum. You can hear that bottom end come in, excuse me, and I want to keep that in our track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a sample of this snare drum that has some weight to it and that has some bottom end. So I'm going to go through here and I'm just going to listen to this first verse and see if there's a snare drum hit that I would like to use as a sample here. So let's hit play. Let's see if we find one that we like. Right off the bat, I like that first one. It has some good bottom end to it, and it's tighter than everything else that comes after it. That ring kind of builds up on the snare the more he hits it, and that first hit doesn't quite have that resonance and that ring that comes through on the rest of the hits. So I'm really digging that first one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this track, and I'm going to come here onto this first hit, and I'm just going to cut it out here with the range tool. So I'm highlighting it, and then I'm going to hold Alt to copy it down to this next track. So Alt, and then click and drag, and now we've copied this snare hit down to another track. And I'm going to use a function here inside of Studio One called tab to transient. I know there's at least a couple other DAWs that have it. I know it's in Pro Tools as well, but I can't speak for Logic or Ableton or anything like that. But tab to transient, I'm going to click on this track here so it's highlighted. I'm going to hit tab, and it's going to take us to the transient on this snare drum. What that means is when we paste this in along our original snare drum, it's going to match up with the original transient of our snare drum. So it's going to paste in phase, and it's going to be in line with our original track. So we're not going to have any phase problems or alignment problems when we put it in with the rest of the drums here. So tab to transient, I'm going to Alt X, so I'm going to cut at that transient. I can get rid of everything beforehand because I don't need that. I'm going to zoom in here as well too, so we can kind of see the bleed on the back end. So in Studio One, we can zoom in down here in the bottom right corner. I'm going to pull this all the way up here so we can see where everything is sitting. We can see our snare drum is ending at least by here. So I'm going to pull that in to there, and we're going to fade it in. So try and get rid of as much of the bleed as possible on this so we can create a clean sample. I'm going to fade all the way to the beginning here. And then I'm going to put just a tiny fade on the front so we don't have any clicks or pops or anything as we enter into this sample. So let's take a listen here and see what this sounds like. There's a little pop of the hi-hat afterwards, so let's see if we can increase this fade here and maybe get rid of some of that. Let's see where we're at now. That's feeling much, much, much better to me. We have a little bit of that hi-hat, but that's okay because that gives it a little bit of this natural vibe that you can hear some of the hi-hat in the snare drum. You're always going to hear some of the hi-hat in a natural snare drum, right? Because the snare is right next to the hi-hat, the mic's right there, so we're going to catch some hi-hat bleed. So leaving a little bit of that in, as much as I'd like to get rid of it and have a really clean, silent snare drum that's just a snare drum and very isolated, I like the benefit of having that little bit of bleed from the hi-hat because it blends better with the rest of the drums, having some of that cymbal bleed in there. So now that we've got this created, I'm going to turn off our snap to grid and our follow and everything like that. So when I bounce this, it's going to bounce directly in place. It's not going to bounce out to the beginning of the bar. It's not going to add anything to the beginning and end of this. It's going to keep our fades in place here. So Command B, we're going to bounce this exactly like it is. So now we have a snare sample. And this is a very natural sounding snare sample compared to the rest of this kit because it's from the original snare drum. What this means is as we add this sample in, it's not going to sound different from this kit. We're not going to have a different snare drum in our overheads and our room mic than we do with our sample. We're not bringing in something that's not a part of this kit. We're using the original snare drum to create a sample. That way it's going to ring the same way in the overheads and the room mic. We're not going to have two different snares fighting for dominance in this track. We have one snare drum sound that's consistent across our spot mic, our overheads, and our room mic here. So now we have our sample. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. So Command C. Now I've got this in my clipboard, so if I mute our kick drum here, what I can do is I can go through on the snare drum. I can turn our snap to grid and follow and everything back on, but I can tab to transient and just keep going along, go down to the next track, Command V, and paste our sample. That's how I'm going through and pasting the sample, and I'm doing it all the way by hand here. It's not that long of a song. It can get tedious with like 4 or 5 minute songs. This is about a 2.5 minute song here. So I can very quickly go through tab to transient, Command V, back up, tab to transient, down, Command V. That's all we're doing to match this sample to the transient of the original snare drum all the way through the track. So up, tab, down, Command V. I missed it there. You can see I miss it sometimes. If you miss it, just reset one back, down, Command V. If you get this kind of muscle memory in your fingers, you can go through pretty speedy on your track here. So you can kind of get into a rhythm with it and really crank these out here. So sometimes you'll miss it though, especially in Studio One with that scratch pad shortcut. I should turn that off because I've never actually used the scratch pad here in Studio One. It kind of just shows up when I make a mistake pasting in samples like this. If I get going too fast, I'll miss the down button or I'll miss the command button and end up opening the scratch pad. What I want to show you though is how I handle fills. So all of these are normal snare drum hits. There's no ghosts. There's no anything like that. So I can work through pretty quickly here, pasting in the sample. Let's see if we can get to a fill here in the song, and I can show you how to handle that. So instead of pasting the fill in with our sample, I like to do a little bit of a hybrid approach here. So here's our first little fill. It's just a triple hit on the snare drum. So if we solo up our snare drum here, let's take a listen to this fill. It's just a little bit of a crescendo here on the snare drum as he hits it 3 times. So instead of pasting through the sample, so let me show you what that, let me show you what that would sound like if I just did that. So we would just have our sample in there 3 times. If we solo up this track, here's what that sounds like. That's a little bit robotic, and if it was any faster, it would 100% be machine gun sounding. So what I'm going to do is, once again, we're going to use our range tool. I'm going to highlight this fill, Alt, click, and drag. Excuse me, just finished lunch here. I'm going to keep burping. I'm copying this fill down, and I'm going to use the original fill here, just adding fades in. So on the back end, we'll fade it out, and on the front end, we will fade it in. So now what we have is we have a little bit of a hybrid of the original snare and a sample, but still created from the original snare drum. So we're keeping that sound and that tone from the original snare drum. So now we have sample, sample, a fill comes up, original snare drum opens back up, and then back to our sample. So it's like the same way we would edit toms out. So edit out the bleed on toms, right? Silent, a tom fill comes along, we open up, we hear our tom fill, and then we close back down and get rid of our bleed. The other thing I like to do with the fills is kind of match the volume on these here. So if I bump this down just a couple hits here, we can kind of see where we're sitting level-wise. So here's our snare samples that we pasted in. We can see the level there, and then we can see the level of the fill and match it. So I want to pull that down a little bit further and kind of see where we're sitting here. What I can also do is pull up that first one, but I like that little bit of crescendo we can get. So you can get really into it. If you want to keep these 3 all the same, I could pull the volume up on this first hit since it's a little quieter, but it does give me that crescendo effect, which sits nicely against the samples. So that's how I'm pulling in the fills. I would just go all the way through the rest of this track here. Anytime I find a fill or anything, I'm just going to pull that down, and then we'll go right back to tab to transient and pasting in the original sample. If you ever lose it when you pull something down, we can always come back to an earlier sample, Command C, and copy it in. Once I'm done here and I've pasted all the way through the track, what I do like to do is create a layer of these little sample hits. So I've created a shortcut here in Studio One, Command L, and it will duplicate the layer for me. But if I look here, right, we've got our duplicate layer, Control L, sorry. So it will duplicate a layer for me. I can name it. I like to edit, or name it, edit, excuse me, mixing up all my words here. I can close my layer. I do like to turn off layers follow events. And then all I would do here is I would merge it, so G, and then I would bounce it out so it's the full length of the track. What we end up with is actually, let me pull in one here. I do have a finished one to show you here. So we can get rid of this guy here. We'll disable it, and then I'll open up this guy. This is the finished sample pasted all the way through, and you can see our fills are pulled in from the original track, but they're still pretty close in volume to our original snare. So I'm going to hit play here right about in the middle of the track, and you can hear these 2 fills as they go by on the snare drum. So we just have that little bit of bleed on our samples, but it keeps our snare feeling natural. There's never a point where you're like, oh, it sounds like a sample, and then suddenly a fill comes in and it's confirmed for you that it is a sample because it sounds machine gunny, it sounds robotic. When our fills come in, they feel natural and they feel authentic to the drummer who played this. We're not replacing their creativity and their fills with some robotic sample. We have our sample in that keeps our snare drum consistent. We open up to a fill from the original drummer, the original performer, and then we come back down to a sample. Even on the build up here, you can hear we keep it natural sounding so it matches the performance as best as possible to the original drummer. So what we're doing here, quick review, all we're doing to create our sample is we're finding a piece from the original snare drum that we like, we're copying it down to a new track, using our tab to transient to get rid of everything beforehand, adding a fade on the back end so it's just the snare drum as much as possible, we're bouncing it, and then again we're using our tab to transient to paste it in matching our original snare drum, and then any fills, we're pulling those down from the original snare drum to preserve the performance and keep our sample as natural as possible. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to level up your drum mixes and go a little bit deeper into the drum mixing process, then you need to check out my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This is a completely free, on-demand video training, and it's going to help you dial in more professional sounding drum mixes right from your home studio. Thank you so much for watching here today. You can get access to that workshop by clicking the link below in the video description. Completely free to watch, and I will see you in the next video.